Okay, let's hear from our guest speaker, Jennifer McCollum. She's the CEO of Linkage Incorporated. She oversees the strategic direction of the global operations of this Boston-based leadership development company. And their mission is a pretty interesting one. The mission is to change the face of leadership. Linkage has dedicated 30 years to improving leadership effectiveness and equity in hundreds of organizations globally. They provide assessments, training, coaching, consulting, and conferences with solutions designed to accelerate purposeful leadership, advance women leaders, and create cultures of inclusion. Jennifer has over 20 years of experience building and leading businesses in this leadership space. Prior to joining Linkage, she spent a decade growing businesses with Korn Ferry and the Corporate Executive Board, now known as Gartner. At the Corporate Executive Board, she led product management within the leadership division, driving innovation in solutions that help organizations select, develop, and place leaders at all levels of the organization. She also ran their Leadership Academies business. And listen to these numbers, folks. This will knock you out. Through the Academies business, they developed more than 30,000 professionals in 2,100 companies throughout 50 countries. And they grew revenue at a 97% combined annual growth rate across 5 years. Len, I think everybody would love to have those numbers from an accounting perspective. Jennifer's passion is creating vision, executing strategy, and managing cohesive teams towards aspirational goals with a special focus on supporting women in leadership roles. She has a master's degree in communications from the University of Stirling in Stirling, Scotland, of all places. There's an interesting story for that, too. She also has an undergraduate degree from Wake Forest University in psychology and communications. She's a very, very active individual. She's an avid tennis player as well as skier and lives in the D.C. area with her husband and 3 children. Jennifer, welcome. Let's welcome everybody, Jennifer.
Thank you, Joe. Note to self, I'm going to ask my team to reduce the length of that introduction. That was very impressive. Thank you.
Very impressive, young lady. I can tell you that. You know, here's an old axiom, business as well as personal, that nothing is as permanent as change. Talk a little bit about Linkage and how have they changed from a leadership perspective in this crazy, tumultuous time that we live in.
So first I want to acknowledge this is my first meeting out of my home in about a year. So this is exciting. Thank you, CEO Club of Baltimore, for getting me up and dressed and out. And it feels hard. It's a change, right? Just like a year ago, March was a massive change in our world. And yes, while the constant is change, we as leaders, all of us in this room, are probably finding our way through our leadership in and around and over that change. Nothing perhaps as significant as certainly what happened to me in my leadership and my company a year ago. So let's just take a step back for a second and think about the last 15 months. Global pandemic, which regardless of whether your company grew or was shattered, and let's just take a quick show of hands, how many really benefited whose companies benefited in the pandemic? Just a show of hands. So technology, potentially distribution, healthcare, financial services. How many companies really were hurt in the pandemic? Just 2? That's really impressive. And how many stayed about the same? Okay. So I was the CEO of a company that was obliterated during the pandemic. 80% of our business was live, in-person, leadership development, consulting, conferences. We had a $5 million conference business. It was completely shut overnight. And what's interesting is the way we lead in times of crisis isn't necessarily different from the way we should lead in times of non-crisis, but that urgency around becoming really clear about how do I lead in the midst of not only the global pandemic, but that was immediately followed by the social injustice and racism that really came front and center then in the summer. That was followed by the wildfires and the economic, and all the way through to Houston in the winter just a couple months ago. So it was like crisis after crisis after crisis hitting, which hopefully, as leaders, causes us to stop and say, wait a minute, how do I take care of my people, my business, my financials in these critical times, but no time more important than a crisis. Whether your business is soaring, whether your business is really hampered, or whether those of you who are lucky enough to stay the same. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but let me pause for a moment.
You know, a lot of the things that you do at Linkage is really bounded by research. Share with us one or two themes or one or two ideas that you found in terms of research and what makes an effective leader.
So let me take a step back because I dove right into the crises. So Linkage is a 33-year-old leadership development firm, and back in the 80s, if for those of us who were working in the 80s, may remember that leadership development was in its infancy. This idea of leadership conferences, leadership coaching, leadership consulting didn't really exist back then. So Linkage was founded, and it's a private equity-backed firm now, but it was founded by this incredible entrepreneur, like many of you, who decided there was an opportunity to link, and hence the term linkage, to link the best of current thinking in the academic world, in the practitioner world of leaders, and in the top leadership thinking world, to link these people together to create something for leaders. And so the Global Institute for Leadership Development was born, that ran for 25 years, and mostly very early thought leaders like Warren Bennis out of USC connected with Linkage, and we started studying leadership. And so that's how our data sets were born, by working with leaders and discovering what is it that the best leaders do. And so we've been doing that for 30 years, and we've been doing it through assessments and development and coaching and coaching. And then we started to look at women leaders specifically. So we have a whole separate data set around 25 years of studying, mostly through assessment and coaching and work with women and their sponsors and mentors and allies and direct reports. What is it that it will take to advance women, both individually in their careers, and what do organizations need to do to really shift this support and additional crisis of women not advancing into top leadership roles? And it hasn't changed significantly in decades, and it's actually really threatened now. So with those two data sets, to answer your question, what did we start to learn? The first thing that surfaced from our data set, about 1 million leaders, was the very best leaders operate as what we call purposeful leaders. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. A couple of years ago, we started looking at the role of inclusion in purposeful leadership. So of all the information we had about what the best leaders do, we isolated specifically what we call inclusive leadership behaviors. And we wanted to know, do you have to be an inclusive leader to be an effective leader? And so our research team, and this, I'm not a data nerd, but it was so fascinating because the research team surfaced a 0.92 correlation, which basically means that if all we did was identify the 16 inclusion behaviors out of the 40 or so behaviors that we measured, if we only looked at the inclusion behaviors, it's about a third of the behaviors, we would be able to predict whether that leader was effective. So the correlation was so strong that you would never do that because for development you want to look holistically at the leader, but it was that powerful. And so then we said, okay, what can we do to help accelerate inclusive leadership and point those inclusive leadership behaviors at really big problems that we have in leadership? One is that we can't get women into top level leadership roles fast enough. Less than 5% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Less than 20% of women are at the C-suite in our country, in publicly traded companies where we can monitor these types of things. And yet women enter the workforce in exactly the same proportion. Actually more women enter the work, or did before COVID, more women enter the workforce than men. So that's one of the big problems and opportunities that we focus on. And now it's extended, so not just women, but also other underrepresented populations like race and ethnicity primarily. And then secondly, the big problem is how do we actually respond as leaders to what we're seeing with the social unrest and the systemic racism and the very same problem of not being able to attract, retain, and engage people of color because they don't feel like they belong. What is it that we in the majority need to do, but what is it as we as leaders need to do to ensure that we're solving the problem of inclusion? And so those are the couple things that we really work hard on that linkage.
Great points. I mean, for the women in our audience right now, what does the future say? Do you see the glass ceiling being shattered a little bit more? Is it going to be more than 5%? Are they coming up the ranks in greater numbers? What does the future look like? 5, 10, 15?
So actually the numbers are worse because of COVID. And so we were talking at our table that 3 million more women than men left the workforce in the last year. Some because women are overweighted in industries like retail and hospitality, industries that were more hurt by COVID. But equally, it's because women opted out because they couldn't do it. So I have, we were talking about our kids. We've got kids home at school. Worse if your kids are younger and couldn't do school independently. So I have people on my team who were working, through the night because they were watching their kids through the day, and so huge challenges. So there's a problem. We're moving backwards instead of forwards, and what we know to be true is that we do need to disproportionately invest in our underrepresented populations as leaders who can support development of that underrepresentation. So in this book, we know that women face unique hurdles to advancement that men don't face, and I can talk about those if you're interested. But we also know it's not about fixing the women or fixing any form of underrepresentation. It's about us as leaders supporting through 3 really critical ways. I'm gonna go there. Okay. The first and probably most important is executive commitment and action. We as women, or we as any underrepresented population, need to be able to look up at the leadership majority, which still today is 80% white male, and we need white males. The majority of the people in the room today. This is about the representation I would have expected. Probably more women in the room than I would have expected if the women are in CEO roles. We have to look up and see the executives not only saying the right things because their HR executives are telling them what to say, we have to be doing the right things. So the question that when we work with executives is, do you know how to be an effective sponsor of women or other populations? Do you know what it means to be an effective ally versus a mentor versus a coach? So we work with executives to help them create commitment and action. The second thing is around culture, and the culture is easier when we look up and see executives operating with that commitment. And the culture answers the question, do I feel like I belong? So am I welcomed here? Is my uniqueness celebrated? And that's the culture piece. And the third is talent systems. Is there equity in the talent systems? So as a woman, and I'll speak for women, but it can be women, it can be race, it can be sexuality, it can be disability, so any form of underrepresentation. Do I feel I have equal opportunity? And the challenge is, because of likability bias, all of us tend to find it easier to engage with those like us. So if I'm like you and you look like me, I am more likely to engage socially with you. I'm more likely to be mentored by you. I'm more likely to be given that stretch assignment, and so that's the equity piece.
You're more likely to be hired by you too. It's like the whole concept, birds of a feather stick together. You gotta be very careful with that when you're making a hiring decision, because there's a natural tendency to do that very thing. Because you relate to somebody that is like you. You can make a hiring mistake that way. It's so important to realize that that is a potential problem. You talked a little bit about purposeful leadership. Love that concept. What do purposeful leaders do in a crisis? And really make a juxtapose a purposeful leader like each one of us versus a purposeful team of people that we work with?
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about both those things. So purposeful leadership is the foundation of what Linkage does. We are a leadership development firm for men and women. We happen to be pointing data sets and a lot of work right now on women and inclusion. But the foundation of what Linkage discovered about 5 or 6 years ago when we were reconsidering whether the leadership model that we had was outdated, and we continued to study it to evolve it. And what we surfaced and we branded purposeful leadership is this. The very best leaders are very clear about their own individual purpose. They are doing something that matters to them personally, but most critically, that matters to someone else, your stakeholders, your family, your investors. So over time, getting really clear about what your purpose is, and I can share mine, and I might ask you yours, Doug, is the foundation. And then aligning that purpose to the organizational direction or goals, so you are living on purpose, is kind of the foundation. But then what those purposeful leaders do is operate with 5 commitments. And we call them commitments because we believe that these can be developed over time, so they're not personality traits, they're not a series of competencies, and I know you're a coach as well, Doug, and you deal with competencies. But the commitments are this. It's what our stakeholders expect of us, and if we fulfill these 5 commitments, we operate in a reinforcing loop where we're delivering against the expectation of our stakeholders, and therefore our stakeholders are operating at their best. And it's 5 things. And it is different in a crisis, and I'll make the differentiation. So the commitments are, number 1, to inspire. And that is, can I paint a picture, an inspiring picture of a vision, of a direction that people want to follow? The difference in a crisis is we have to look much shorter term. So I had a 3-year vision painted for Linkage in a crisis because we had to make such massive changes to our business so quickly. Sometimes that inspiration was around what we're going to accomplish this quarter, this month, or sometimes even this week or day. So inspire. Second is engage. And engage is, do your stakeholders feel like they can contribute? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like their contribution is meaningful? So in a crisis, the worst thing we can do is take a set of senior leaders and throw them into a room while the rest of the staff is waiting to see what's happening. So can we engage everybody to feel like they're a part of the solution? I'll tell you a quick story of how we did this, and it was through a mentor of mine who you may have read about or met. His name is Alan Mulally, and he was the CEO of Boeing Commercial Aircraft, and then later the CEO of Ford, and completely turned Ford around when everyone thought it was going to go out of business. And he introduced me to what is called the BPR, the Business Plan Review. And he said, Jennifer, every single week at Ford, I would gather my entire executive team. And there was like 18 of them. Every head of function, every head of, his was by geography. And he said, we would go through a set of business metrics over 2 hours every single week. And everybody had to agree on where we were, where our risks were, where our opportunities were. And that engagement every single week created a team that basically turned around for it. So I actually instilled that practice at Linkage right before the crisis hit. The third is innovate. All of us as leaders are constantly in a state of change and flux, but what are we driving innovation toward? And in a crisis, at least how I experienced it, was innovation had to happen so quickly and so immediately that we couldn't have the innovation without the engagement. And then fourth is achieve. Most early leaders will believe that they themselves have to do the achieving. As we evolve in our leadership, the achieve really means putting the structures and the processes in place and stepping out of the way so the achievement can happen through others. And then the final one, and this is where inclusion doesn't live only, but it really comes to life around, is become. And become is that self-awareness, that inner path to leadership, the curiosity, the consideration, the self-awareness, and the courage to learn more about yourself and your leadership every single day. And that requires putting a mirror up in front and being willing to listen to others and to receive feedback that hopefully can make us all better.
Love that story about Ford, because you're really talking about the concept of discipline. A lot of people move away from that, in a crisis you're either forced to react and react quickly, or a lot of negative things can happen. Just curious, you said your company was backed by private equity, and I know private equity people, we have some M&A people here in the room. Private equity people can be, a little bit impatient at times. Were they on your side during the transition? You said, a huge chunk of your business is face-to-face, doing seminars and conferences. How were you able to rebound so quickly?
Yeah. Well, it hasn't been easy. In fact, for those of you who know, private equity, they're on a 7-year cycle. And we were year 6 into the 7-year cycle. And when I was hired 3 years ago, I said to the private equity board, and they are a wonderful board, interestingly, an all-white male private equity board, as most are. When they hired me, I said that the challenge that you're going to have is I've got a transformation strategy that's going to take a year or 2 or 3 longer than you'd like before you need to sell this business. But if you don't have the patience and you're not willing to invest, that's okay. But I'm probably not the right CEO for you. And so I put together a productization strategy, which is moving away from custom in-person work to something more scalable, more digital, and more repeatable. And the reason we wanted to do that was to impact more leaders at earlier stages in their career. So instead of working with one leader, one executive team, what would it look like to work with hundreds or thousands of leaders at large organizations? And we work with small companies too, that wanted to invest in their leaders or invest in their women in earlier stages. So to answer your question, we have delayed the sale process by a couple of years, and COVID set us back by another year.
But they're staying behind you, so that's the important thing. Talk a little bit
now.
or else, right? Talk a little bit about, you're right, I do some executive coaching. And I've seen over the past year, a lot of people at the executive level really hurt. There's some people that just feel overwhelmed by, the crisis with COVID, the crisis with the business, crisis at home. Share some thoughts there. What do you have any specific, advice for people that may be feeling overwhelmed with all those nuances associated, with themselves and their business and their world?
Yeah. I realized I didn't answer the other question about the team, so I'll talk about what to do with the team, and then I'll talk about the personal side of that. And then I'd love to hear from you all, just to hear what you're experiencing too. So in a crisis, and Alan Mullally actually helped coach me through this, because I went to him and said, I know Alan, it's really bad. And we're doing the DPR process and we're meeting every week, but I've got to make some really difficult decisions. I've got to lay off a third of the staff. I've got to slash our budgets. I've got to slash our salaries. And he said, Jennifer, the most important thing that you and your leadership team can do during a crisis is acknowledge the reality of the business and communicate it to everyone. Don't pretend. You've got to acknowledge it. And so when we laid off, 20 some people, I had individual conversations with every single one of them, and crying. It was very emotional for me personally because it was a devastating decision. But because of the way we were able to do it in a very transparent way and supporting the staff as much as we could, I was getting emails from the staff, thanking me for the way it had been done and worried about me, asking about me. So deal with the reality, number one. Number two, do what it takes to create the better plan. The company today looks very differently than a company a year ago because the better plan was completely virtualizing our conference, accelerating our digital product strategy 6 months earlier than we had planned to, virtualizing everything that we had done live. And so that was the better plan. So those are a couple of things we did as a team. But as an individual, and I'd really love to hear what's been working for you all, but for me, I had to get really clear about what it is that I could achieve in this environment. And by the way, I had 3 kids at home that were homeschooling during COVID, and I was experiencing a lot of the same pressures as my staff. What clarity around what we can accomplish and what are we going to say no to. There were many things that we pushed out because we just didn't have the capacity to do it. And then third, to your point, the coaching industry has actually really accelerated during COVID because we as leaders need help. And the fact that I had Alan to go to as my mentor and coach during that period really helped me a lot.
Doesn't hurt to lean on something. That's the name of the game, whether it's a spouse or a coach or whatever. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open up to the audience. Last year, I know you guys did some groundbreaking research on the concept of inclusive organizations. Share with us, if you can, what did you discover? What did you find out?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that we did a correlation of what do effective leaders do and what is the role of inclusion in that. And so we isolated 16 behaviors that we measure and we help leaders see. And here's the trick. Most of us think we are way better than we actually are. And for those of us lucky enough to become aware because we get the feedback or we have an assessment, it allows us to go, okay, I get it. I think I'm a really inclusive leader, but then when I hear from my direct reports through an anonymous survey or even not an anonymous survey, it helps me awaken. So I'm going to read I actually pulled it because I thought it'd be fun. I'm just going to read 4 of the behaviors that we measure, and I want you to reflect on your own leadership and just think about how would your staff answer this if they were measuring you. So, does this leader encourage a culture where people speak up regardless of experience or background? So just think, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate yourself? Second, does this leader show empathy and concern for others individually? Third, does this leader create an environment in which others can openly discuss and learn from failures and obstacles? And I would even go further, we don't ask the question this way, but does this leader encourage failures and learning from those failures? And then finally, does this leader give others the power to participate in decision-making and to share ownership in the outcomes? So we just did an engagement survey at Linkage, and one of the things that came back, we scored fairly well, but one of the things that came back as one of the lowest scoring things was, I feel like I can contribute to solving the business challenges and problems at Linkage. It was interesting because I'm like, gosh, my leaders come together every single week and we're solving the problems. But if you're not in that business plan review, do they feel the same way? So we're thinking about some creative ways to do that.
Great points, especially the concept of failure. How many people have read the book by the founder of USA Today, Diary of an SOB? Anybody read that book? It's great. It's about failure, and he says, if you're in your mid-30s or late 30s and you haven't failed at something, you better hurry up and fail because you will not be a success until you've known and appreciated failure.
Tell us your best failure story.
When I was a paper boy when I was 12. That's a great question. I invested in a company probably when I was like 29, 30. I was finishing graduate school, I was working full-time, and finishing my doctorate at night. And I was investing in a company that, in retrospect, made every mistake in the world. I mean, every mistake. Look back and said, how could you possibly have done that? You know, you're a halfway smart person. And almost lost everything. You know, I mean, my partner in that business deal, he could have gone bankrupt and left me holding the bag. And the loan was for more money than I ever had. We worked it out, and we paid everything off in the long run. And I tell you, going through that from a failure perspective really makes you appreciate success. And founder of USA Today talks about that. I mean, if you haven't failed at something, you better hurry up because you really can't appreciate success until you've been at that lower level. How about you? What would you characterize as your failure? It really helped to shape you.
Yeah, I had a failure recently, actually. So I left, I managed leadership businesses in the publicly traded space for about a decade, and then I won't name the firm, but I went to a large leadership search and consulting firm, and it was going to be my dream job. It was Gartner was acquiring CEB. I knew they were going to divest the business I was leading, so I jumped ship and went to this other firm where I was promised the keys to the kingdom. It was going to be a $100 million business. I was going to manage the leadership assessment, leadership development, digital products. I loved the boss that had recruited me. I'd worked for him before, and when I got there, there were some warning signs. It was, well, you're not going to report directly to me. You're going to report to this other guy, and I didn't really like the other guy. And we don't have a job description yet because it's a brand new business unit, but you're going to create your job description. And so it was one of those things like, okay, but I was really trusting of the person who recruited me. And so I got there, and 3 weeks later, because of a corporate political battle above me, he was ousted. And so the person who brought me in was suddenly gone, and I had no sponsor. I had no one helping me navigate this new publicly traded company, not new, but this publicly traded company where I was a new employee. And I tried really hard for 6 or 8 months. It was, trying to find my way in an organization where I'd been promised a job and it didn't manifest. And I just went to them and I said, maybe it's time to agree that the job I was hired for actually doesn't exist. And if you'd like to lay me off, then I would accept that. I'm not giving you a signing bonus back, but I will leave. And we did. We agreed, and I left. And I took an 8-month sabbatical, and decided that this is the beauty of failure. I worked through a book called Designing Your Life, and if you're in a career transition ever, I would recommend this. And I got really clear on: do I want to go back to a publicly traded company? Do I want to go to a startup? And I ended up looking at $20 to $50 million mid-market, some private equity backed, some nonprofit. And by the end of the 8 months, I had 3 opportunities and chose to be the CEO of Linkage. But I never would have been there had I not had the failure experience.
Right, build character, and it took a lot of guts on your part. There's a lot of people that didn't, in organizations, they feel trapped. And they're not only trapped in their jobs, but they're trapped in life. And they feel that they can't make that transition. You were allowed to take that 8-month sabbatical, and you were able to really reinvent yourself, what you really wanted to do. Hats off to you.
Thank you. Well, and I think, you actually raised an important thing, and that's kind of the concept of privilege. I did have the privilege to take that 8 months. I have a wonderful husband who was working full time. So we financially could do it, and there are a lot of people that can't do that. And so the concept of privilege is something that we also get in touch with. And when we're doing, I never finished your question. So when we're doing our inclusion work, there's a lot of work around, can you get in touch with privilege? Can you get in touch with things that we may or may not be doing consciously? Most of the time it's unconscious. Unconscious bias is a big buzzword right now. Microaggressions is a big buzzword right now. And at Linkage, we believe those things are important to understand because it's what's created the problems, but it's not the solution. The solution is to point our individual and collective activities and behaviors toward things that unite us and that will make a positive difference. And so we're actually even moving away from language of diversity and inclusion, and we're moving toward language called superpowers and symphony. And I'd like to talk about it for just a moment. In the research that we did across 2020, we surfaced the 3 most critical organizational behaviors for driving culture change around inclusion. And one of them, not surprising, is that the critical role of the executive level. Like, are they operating in a way that is welcoming, equitable, and fair? The second is for all of us as managers, and this is why we call it superpowers. It's making sure that managers understand the individual uniqueness in every single one of your team members. So as a team member of yours, do I feel like my uniqueness, my superpower is understood? Is it valued, and is it used? And if we can introduce ourselves in our uniqueness and in our strengths, it moves away from gender, race, role, disability, because we're talking about aligning the strengths of our individuals to create organizational unity or harmony, which is why we call it symphony. So that was number 2. And then number 3 is something for the entire workforce, which is that the way we get work done is through meetings. And we as leaders and we as the workforce, how we engage with each other in inclusive meetings is really important. And so leaders, the worst thing we can do is have the first answer. We have to be way more quiet in meetings. We have to solicit the input of the most junior person in the room. We have to acknowledge who spoke and maybe didn't get recognized. And so the behaviors, we teach these actually to the workforce and the managers. How do we actually behave in a way that draws out the strengths of our team? Because if we have the first answer, guess what? That becomes a mandate. And so it's another Alan Mulally quote when he goes, Jennifer, when you run this BPR, he said, you only can have 4 words. Yes, thank you, I understand. Next on the agenda. Do not come up with the idea because it will become the mandate. So that kind of stays in my head a lot about how can I be more inclusive in my meetings, because if I have an idea, they run off and do it.
Let's have one quick story and then we'll open it up to the audience. Just you smile and think about when I was on a consulting job with Ken Wexley many years ago. We were in West Virginia, and the executive there that was running the company goes, I don't know what the hell is going on. People just don't respond. I go to a meeting, nobody says anything, it's just ridiculous. So we sat in on a couple of meetings. It was pretty obvious what was going on. We started the meeting, somebody had a suggestion. He goes, that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Anybody else have anything to say? And just put the people down. We got out of the meeting, he comes back to us, he goes, you see what I mean? He didn't have an idea. He didn't realize what he was doing, and you're exactly right. You've got to let your people talk. You got to have a space where people feel comfortable, that they can talk, and you will listen, and it's got to be, all hands on deck. And you really got to create that environment where there's not a stupid answer. When you get to a brainstorming session, you use a whiteboard, anything should go. That's how you get the free flow, and you're not inhibiting your employees at any time. Let's open up to the audience. Anybody have a question for Jennifer? Yes, Mercedes. See, Mercedes has a question. Not BMW, Mercedes.
Can you talk about the benefits, though, of inclusion? Like, I've heard that companies do that overall, because
I'm so glad you raised that. So Mercedes asked, what are the benefits? And so sometimes I forget to talk about the business case because it's so well documented, but it's so hard to do. And so whether you're talking about inclusion or advancing women specifically, there are incredibly solid business cases. So, revenue and profits, so better financial outcomes, greater innovation, faster and better decision making. So I was actually talking to the head of this brand new role, Dr. Tanya Matthews, and she just took the role. She left academia to take the role as the CEO of the new African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. It's opening in the next year or so. And I was talking to her about our new inclusion work, and I got to the page that had the business case, and it's like, twice as much revenue and profit and 4 times faster decisions. And I said, I skip over this page quickly because not only is it so well documented, but I never have anyone make a decision to go forward or not with one of our programs because of the business case. And she said, if it were that simple, if it were only about the money, or only about the speed of innovation or decision making, we would have solved these problems a long time ago. She said, there's hidden forces, and then, again, conscious or unconscious, there's hidden forces to keep things the same. Those forces are more powerful than the forces for change. And she said, if I were you, I'd move away from talking about the business case in terms of what I just mentioned, and I would talk about it in terms of the emotional benefits, because especially for the leadership majority, the emotional benefits have to go beyond doing the right thing. If we are more inclusive in our organizations, if we have women and other diversity in our leadership ranks, we become better leaders, but we also become more influential, we become more powerful because of what we created. She said, you gotta move away from talking about the financials, because if it was only about that, we would have done it a long time ago. And that was just recently, I thought that was
What's interesting as well, when you talk about money, It's not about the money. Money is usually on the scale of, what motivates employees. It's usually anywhere from 3 to 7 on the list, not 1 or 2. I can tell you that. So be conscious of that as well when you're dealing with your employees. Who else has a question for Jennifer? Yes, Christine.
What has data shown you, or what have you found as to the best ways to foster conversations surrounding failure?
Surrounding failure? Oh, I love this. So you may know of a woman named Carla Harris. You might know her. She works at the top ranks of Morgan Stanley. And she's this most amazing African-American woman who's an author, a gospel singer, a financial, not even a financial planner, she's a partner at Morgan Stanley, a mother, and she speaks at we have a Women in Leadership conference every single year, and last year 1,500 women came virtually, the year before 1,000 came live, and we're gonna have it live again in Florida. So you have women on your teams, send them to Orlando in November. But anyway, Carla is the co-host of this Women in Leadership Institute with me, and she talks about how we as leaders have to model appropriate failure behavior. And so she tells the story of, she's like, and when you hear it in a meeting and you go, John or Jill, like that mistake, that failure, whew, that was a big one. We're gonna pay heavily for that one. But I'm gonna stand up and applaud you for trying. And what we're gonna do now in this meeting, in this moment, is we're gonna talk about what we learned from that mistake and how we would try it differently next time. She said, you make sure you stand up and applaud. And so that's the leadership behavior that is so important, because then I go, I'm gonna try and innovate, and look, if I fail, I'm not gonna get fired. If I fail, gotta be within the appropriate boundaries, I hope, but we're gonna learn from it. So that's one example of how we as leaders need to model the good failure behavior.
Anybody else? Well, that's such a great Go ahead, Wes.
I came in, I apologize, a little bit late. Did I hear you talking about business metrics, financial business metrics that you were going over on a regular basis?
Probably for 4 days.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So there's financial business metrics that offer the business case for companies that have women and diversity in their leadership. So the business case for that. We also talked about the financials of.
That was it. So all I wanted to say was that over the last 14 months, I've discovered more financial business metrics inside our company than for the first 35 years. Because of COVID, having to find metrics that would give me a vision into the future as to what was coming. And my point was, when I heard you say that, it resonated with me, how important it is to look at these financial metrics. And for me, it was ones that we had never looked at before.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so you probably were reacting to in the Alan Mullally's business plan review, which we've adopted. We've got about 40 metrics that some are lagging indicators, some are leading indicators. But the most important things is it surfaces, and we go, from revenue to margin to cash flow to product development to capacity of our delivery teams to our operational metrics. So we, to our HR and IT risk, and we rank everything on a red, yellow, green. But yeah, it's looking at those metrics together every week has made a big difference.
We were just talking about failure. It's an interesting concept. Again, especially in your own organization, but you'll say to yourself, I hope you'll allow the environment for somebody perhaps to quote unquote fail. But you don't want anybody to quote unquote fail that can take the company down. So, it's a monitoring type of thing. It's creating that open environment, creating that safe environment where people feel comfortable. But at the same time, it's got to be the discipline in an organization so that you guys can stay alive. Would you agree with that, Jim?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I'd like to tell a couple stories. And I want to get back to the women's leadership thing for a second, if that's okay.
Sure.
And it really hit me during the presidential election when we saw Kamala Harris and Mike Pence debating. But because there are a lot of men in the room, I want to tell a story about what it is like and how hard it is to be a rising woman in an organization, and the critical role that men play in identifying that and supporting and sponsoring women. So I'm going to tell two stories. One takes me back to my 20s, and I was always a very ambitious and competitive and independent person, just growing up, and my childhood supported that, growing up in Europe and moving to the States for the first time when I was in middle school. So I was always very scrappy and competitive. And when I got into my 20s, I was working for Coca-Cola on the Olympic Games in 1996, and so I was the communications manager for the Olympic torch relay. And we took the Olympic flame from Los Angeles to Atlanta, over 10,000 torch bearers in 42 states in 100 days. And there was always this real tension between as is the case typically, for the sponsors of this sports property, as they called it at Coca-Cola, and the Olympic Games, which was very pure. The Olympic Organizing Committee doesn't want any branding associated with the flame or the rings, but yet they're dependent on the sponsors to fund everything, right? So there's this tension. So we were crisscrossing the country, and I was in the communications field at the time, and we were doing all kinds of interviews on TV, and our job was to beat out the Olympic Committee. So we would get ahead of them because we wanted Coca-Cola to be integrated into the story, and they didn't. And one day my boss came to me, and I think I was 25 or 26, and he started laughing, and he goes, David, you know how David describes you? And he was like the big shot on the Olympic Committee who was on the road with the flame. He was the communications guy, and I said, no, and he goes, he describes you as a cupcake with a razor blade inside. And he thought it was hilarious. My boss thought it was hilarious. And I was devastated. And over the decades, reflecting back, it represents this perfect illustration of what's called the double bind for women. So all of us, men or women, in our unconscious, associate leadership with traits that typically are more defined by men. So competitive and aggressive and assertive. And so, and then they define the traits of women as sweet and cooperative and collaborative. And so this cupcake with the razor blade represents this double bind of having to be both, assertive and aggressive as, trying to meet the expectations of Coca-Cola and my role, but sweet and kind and collaborative to meet the expectations of the woman. And then when you add race in, that becomes a triple bind. And so women are dealing with this all the time, and you saw it on the Kamala Harris-Mike Pence debate, where, and regardless of your political bent, it doesn't matter. When you just watch it, apart from the fly part, you could see it through the whole thing, where she was smiling, and she was smiling, and she was gritting her teeth, and then she would say, I'm talking, and so I just kept thinking, razor blade cupcake, razor blade cupcake, and that's what women deal with all the time. And if you are a Black woman, it becomes even harder, because then you have the expectations of the culture. So that's just a story I wanted to tell for awareness building, and then I want to tell another story that happened just 4 months ago. And all of this is to say that we all have a role to play here. But let me just pause. Do you want another story? I don't want to keep telling.
No. Everybody want another story? Yeah. I want to hear another story. One more story.
All right, so 4 months ago, and this is actually a story about what I should have done differently, but I hope maybe you'll resonate with it. So 4 months ago, I was invited to join a CEO forum. There were about 150 CEOs, and I was excited about it. I was a guest, and it was to talk about the impact of COVID on our business and planning for 2021 strategy. And so it was like a 2 hour, maybe an hour and a half Zoom. So I'd show up, 150, we immediately get put into breakout groups, and I show up with 8 people on this Zoom, never been associated with this organization before. Not surprising at all. There's 6 men, 2 women, 5 white men. One of them was Latin, and they all run businesses about the size of ours, some mid-market. So the facilitator of the group, this awesome guy, who says, "All right, this is what we're going to do. Like we're gonna talk about our strategy. We need someone to capture the conversation and to feed it back." And so I just got really quiet because 1, I was a guest in this group. 2, I don't want to do it. And but I kind of held my breath because I thought I knew what was coming. So one of the guys says, "I nominate Jennifer to take the notes." And I said, well, thank you for the nomination. I said, I'm a guest and I don't really want to. And so he said, okay, then I nominate Vicky. And so completely unconsciously, this guy offers up both women to take the notes. And that's not even the best part of the story. What I had hoped would happen, and this is an example of what really good allyship looks like, what I hoped would happen was that the facilitator of the group were to say, oh, you know what, Jim, I nominate you to take the notes. And, like, if you would have said anything, we would have laughed about it, right? But here's what I should have done. I should have completely objectively, because I don't think he did anything consciously, right? Completely objectively, I should have said, you know what, Jim, like, this is super interesting. Like, you just asked both the women to take it. Did you realize that? Like, I'm in retrospect, I'm willing to do it, but let's talk about it. And not in an aggressive way. And again, aggressive is one of those words that women fear, right? Because oftentimes we are described as aggressive. My son said the other day, I don't know about that Kamala Harris mom. She seems really aggressive to me. And I went, wow, let's talk about that. Would you have said that about if it were a man instead of a woman? So this is all unconscious, right? But here's the thing, because I didn't say anything, and because I was kind of ticked off, I completely disengaged. So I wasted 90 minutes of my life. I got nothing out of the session. I left angry, and nobody won. So I tell that story because one was from 25 years ago, and one was from 4 months ago. But these are some of the challenges that we support men and women overcoming those hurdles to advancement, and men and women to support being better sponsors and allies for women and race.
It's a great story. Any final question you got for Jennifer? Hey folks, thank you all for coming. See you at the next CEO Club meeting. Thank you, Jennifer. Remember.